Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of our music podcast. Today, we are going to be discussing a recording studio that was located in upstate New York during the late 1980s and early 1990s. It was called Kimchanda Sound Studios. Don't look for it because it's not there anymore. But we spent a lot of time there, and I thought it would be interesting to have a conversation about how demos and records were recorded during the late 80s and early 1990s and contrast that with maybe what's happening today. I am joined by Peter Shore in New York City and producer Shane in Boston. Hey guys.
Good evening, gentlemen. How are you?
How's it going, Peter?
I'm doing well, hanging in there.
It's good to see you, man.
Good to see you too.
So let's start. My recollection of Kimchanda, there were a couple of sessions. I think you guys recorded there more than I did, but there was one in December of 1990. We recorded there on December 28th and 29th, looking at my journal, in 1990. And then again in April of 1991, early April 4th and 5th. And those recording sessions, they were a neat experience because basically what we used to do, we'd be in school or working and we'd have these little breaks, usually, winter break or spring break, and we would utilize that time to get together and record. So they were significant, not only in the sense that we were trying to be productive in the musical sense, but it also was a chance for us as friends and brothers in arms to get together and bond a little bit.
Yeah, that was the perfect place for that.
What I really thought was unique about this studio was it was not only a recording studio, but it was also part of what probably at some point may have been part of the ski resort across the street, possibly ski lodges. So versus, in most cases, recording there turned out to be a multi-day experience. I had recorded there prior to December. I actually did my first project there back in August. But what was nice about it, along with the recording, you were also offered accommodations, which were awesome to be able to have, access to, the kitchen and the cabin, so to speak, that was on the property.
This was a neat place in the sense that you could go there to record, but also temporarily move in. There was lodging, so if you needed to, stay for the weekend or for a week, that option existed. And this studio was located kind of in the middle of nowhere, in a sense. As you mentioned, across the road, New York State County Route 10, I believe that was the name of the road. There was a ski resort. In the 1970s, it was called Scotch Valley. And then at some point it changed ownership and became Deer Run. But that was part of the surrounding scenery. And it was very rustic and very secluded. So you really felt like you were in the middle of nowhere.
We were. What was great about it was that the studio and the lodges had these big windows. And I remember sleeping over there, and my bed was angled where you could look out the window. And in the morning when you woke up, you just see mountains covered with snow. It was gorgeous. It reminded me of the place called Le Studio where Rush used to record some of their, I know they recorded moving pictures there. They probably recorded Signals there as well, but it reminded me of that atmosphere.
I was just thinking that prior to you saying it, the Rush music video for, I can't remember the song, and it felt like that. It felt like, a ski resort, which it was. I think it was an extension of the ski resort. But yeah, you could actually look out from the, the porch and see the resort across the street, and it was tucked in the mountains, and the valley was beautiful.
One of the things I wanted to touch upon, and Shane, you might be the person to answer this. The studio had an interesting name, and what was the inception of the name of the studio, Kimchanda Sound Studios?
My understanding is that it was named after the owner's two daughters, Kim and Chanda. But I don't recall ever meeting the owner, but the studio was operated by his brother, Rob Masivas, who would engineer and produce all of the sessions, at least that I was associated with. And I had a few friends that actually recorded there. I had found out about that studio from a friend of mine that had recorded there earlier in the year. Technologically, at the time, it was pretty much state of the art. So to find it so close to home was a real, it was like a hidden treasure, because I had no idea that it existed. Compared to the other studios that we had access to, it was, from a technological standpoint, state of the art at the time.
It did seem state of the art, and there was always these, I don't know if they were rumors or urban legends, but apparently quite a few well-known artists from New York City would come up and record there. One that stands out, I don't know if this is true, was Cyndi Lauper. Do you guys know anything about that, or did you ever hear that before?
I remember that name. I remember her name being brought up. Most notably was Blood, Sweat, and Tears in the 70s. And the drum set that we would use when we recorded belonged to Blood, Sweat, and Tears. So the song Spinning Wheel, the drums on that are the same drums that were at the studio.
That's
Another
amazing.
thing about the studio, it was the first time I ever saw an automated soundboard where after you finished a session, he could save all his settings and all the faders would come down to 0. And then the next day we'd go in, he'd say, "Pete, check this out." And then he'd turn on the board, press a button, and all the faders were exactly where they were when we left them, the night before. So that was interesting. It was state of the art at the time.
Yeah, and there was something about the environment there. I don't know what it was, but it was very conducive to getting into the zone. And in December of 1990, the three of us, we went in together and tracked 2 songs. And to this day, I don't know why, but they really are probably 2 of the better guitar solos I've ever recorded in my life. And one of the tracks was called Fight for Me. And this is really interesting. When you listen to that song, that guitar take is a single take. The rhythm guitar, the lead guitar, all of it, that is one straight take. There was no overdubs, and it just lightning struck. It was one of those things where I'm not sure I could do that again, but we managed to capture it on tape, and I was very excited because it just seemed to be, at that time, about as good as I could have performed it.
I remember those sessions. Those songs, I remember one, Fight for Me was tough. I was still coming into my own with writing lyrics. So I was still about a year and a half into being a writer. But I remember Rob, the engineer, being very supportive. And I was playing drums too in those sessions. And we talked a lot about being a pocket drummer and just holding everything together. And I wasn't doing anything fancy on the drums. I was just holding it together. And I remember listening to, we'd come in and listen to the takes, and he'd be bopping his head, and he'd go, "That's great. You're right in the pocket. You're right in the pocket." So he was supportive that way. With singing, it's just a matter of finding that correct melody and staying in your range, which is what I learned from that session.
We went back in April of 1991 and tracked, I guess, 3 songs during that session. And one of the songs that we tracked was a song called "I'll Save Tonight for You," which we had recorded previously, but decided we wanted to attempt a more refined recording. And that one seemed to capture a really nice vocal performance. When I compare it to the original, it seemed very heartfelt and comfortable.
Yeah, I was still getting over a breakup. So when raw emotions are there, it's easy to create. It's a good inspiration. And like you said, being up there was conducive to getting in the zone, because you were isolated, and you just felt all the stress of the world just went away when you were up there. It was very serene.
That's a perfect description. And another interesting piece of trivia about that recording session in April of 1991 is that It was very spontaneous. It was impromptu. You were scheduled to go to South Carolina for spring break. And for some reason, at the last minute, your plans fell apart. And you called me and you said, I'm not going to South Carolina. And my wheels got spinning. And I'm thinking, let's take advantage of this. And within a day or two, we had booked the studio. We had made plans. That's the amazing thing about that period of time. When I look back, is we just were able to sort of get things done very quickly. And somehow, maybe it was because we just didn't have other responsibilities, but Wednesday afternoon, we have a conversation. Friday, we're in the studio recording 3 new songs. So it was a really special time in life in that regard.
Yeah, the only thing I remember about several of the sessions there was just from a financial standpoint. Yeah, everything else was easy, but sometimes financing those sessions, wasn't quite so simple. I was doing a longer project there later that year, and we ran out of money. Like we couldn't finish it. I mean, I would imagine that there would have been a decent amount of demand because it's a destination studio. You would think where it's located, the equipment that was there, that it would be there would be incentive for bands to maybe come up from the city or established acts to come up and record there. So maybe we were getting these weekday or special last minute rates or what have you. But I remember on more than one occasion, it was a challenge just to be able to financially finish some of the projects there, because it wasn't inexpensive, or I don't believe it was a flat rate. It was a decent rate per day to use the studio and everything that it came with.
Well, there were expenses involved with recording at a studio like that back in those days that don't really exist anymore. Well, if you're recording all digitally. For example, I remember this strange process where we showed up for one recording session, and the first hour or two was Rob calibrating the tape machines. I didn't even know what that meant, but I did know we were being charged for it. And then obviously you had to buy the tape, the 1/4 inch or the 2-inch tape that everything was mixed down to. So this was before the days where someone would just hand you a CD or email you an MP3. I mean, you had to buy the media where everything was bounced to.
Yeah, which wasn't inexpensive and wasn't the easiest to obtain either, so we were probably paying to buy it directly from the studio, which is probably, upcharged. But
2 interesting recording sessions took place there that were beyond the scope of the band that the 3 of us were in. I know that you and Peter got together at one point and recorded a song called Light of Hope, which was a little more progressive and heavy. And I remember when I heard it, I thought it sounded great. What was the story behind Light of Hope?
Well, I had found out about the studio from my friend Dean that I had played in bands in when I was younger, along with Darren. Actually, our first band was the 3 of us. He had a heavy metal based band out of Syracuse, and they had come down and recorded. So he told me about the studio, and that the producer was more in tune with heavy metal music and producing that than maybe some of the other people we'd worked with before. That was the story, it was sold to me that way. Hey, there's other, bands, and there were some bands like Anthrax and some of these guys that would record or were from upstate New York, and I was like, oh, this would be a great place to record. So I just put together a project that was a little more progressive than the stuff we were doing in Vicious, So like I had a soft spot for some of this harder stuff that wasn't as commercial, so it was an opportunity for me to record. So I put a band together with Temporary with Peter, Carl Anthony on bass, who had a great career in heavy metal, played with all sorts of bands, and my friend Dean, who I'd found out about the studio, but was great. It took a lot of time. We spent 2 days on it. But one thing I remember is that the Rob and the playbacks, they had these huge playback monitors. Just like, it was like, something you'd see in an arena. I never remember seeing speakers like that in a studio. Sometimes I like to mix on smaller, smaller speakers, but the playback, it was like just a wall of sound. It was unbelievable.
I just remember Dean Dufresne, how he would set up his rack toms with, most people have them sort of flat or on a, close to a 45-degree angle. He had them basically at 180-degree.
Yeah, I think, yeah, he had a unique way of setting up his drums back then. Yeah, I remember that.
Good drummer, but that was very unorthodox. And
Yeah.
I said, well, if it works for him, that's all that matters. And yeah, he brought his own kid in. I remember that. And I remember doing the vocals. Yeah, it was different from what we were doing, going to a little bit of a heavier side. So I tried to get my inner Bruce Dickinson out in terms of lyric writing.
So another important recording session that took place, Shane, was one that was organized by you and Chris Christensen and another local musician named Curtis Quackenbush. And to the best of my knowledge, that's one of the finer recordings of Curtis that I've heard that exists.
Yeah, he was a super talent. But I much like Peter in the beginning. I mean, we were asking Kurt to completely go out of his comfort zone. He was a fantastic singer, a little bit ahead of his time, but really came from more punk and alternative roots than heavy metal. But he was by far, outside of Peter, the best singer in the area. So he did us a favor and came in to work it. But that was kind of the mosh pot of everything that used to happen back then. It's like this was after another year being a Vicious Angel and doing more commercial, I really had pent up, progressive music that I wanted to record, logical to go there. And Chris and I were working on some stuff that was pretty progressive. And we're like, we don't have a singer, who's going to sing this? And that's how Kurt ended up doing it. A bit of a stretch for him. But that, out of all of the sessions at Kim Chanda, that took the longest. We stayed there for several days and put a lot of time into that recording.
Was that the session where your budget ran out?
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember Rob was going off to Berkeley in the fall in Boston. And I'm like, can you just call your mom and tie this into Berkeley somehow and something to do with college so we can come up with another $500 to book another day or two? It was something like that. It was a lot of money. So yeah, that was one where we ran out of time and money. But ultimately figured out a way to finish it, I believe, somehow.
Yeah, I remember hearing a finished product. I remember Rob's drumming on that one was particularly good. I wasn't there for it, but I remember hearing that Rob Macevis was clamping down on him, to like with me, stay in the pocket, stay on time, and everything else will fall into place.
And it's worth noting that was the final session that I ever did there. And it was during a period of time where there's a lot of growth in a short period of time. So, think of all the gigs and rehearsals that had happened between even the session in April to that session. We were playing a lot. So there was a lot of personal growth, which probably helped contribute to the, more polished and better final product.
So the session with Curtis Quackenbush and Chris Christensen was recorded in August of '91, approximately.
I would probably say July.
Oh, in July.
Yeah, because I know in August of '91 I had moved to Syracuse, so it was sometime in late July.
A couple of other little pieces of trivia about the April 1991 recording session at Kim Chanda. Again, I'm really fond of, there's things about those recordings I like and other elements that maybe haven't aged as well. I really was happy with the guitar sound that we managed to capture. And part of that is, Shane, you were nice enough to let me use your JMC 800 Marshall, which sounded amazing. During the 91 session, I was using a Digitech whammy pedal, which was sort of a very cutting edge piece of technology at the time. It was basically like a wah pedal, or you could change it to this pedal that would shift the octave way up, a la Rage Against the Machine. And then the acoustic guitars, I used or borrowed your Kramer Farrington acoustic electric guitar, which was a staple back in those days as well.
Yeah, all sessions at Kim Chanda, it was the first time that we were probably using just the next level in terms of pro gear. We were using a lot of those solid state, smaller amp combos that were inexpensive and sold at the local music store. So yeah, at that point we were using Marshall and Jackson and some higher end equipment that certainly affected sound quality.
And the first time we recorded there, again, those two songs, Drop Dead in Love and Fight for Me, where I felt like I captured lightning in a bottle, maybe the one and only time. I was using the guitar behind me on the left, which is my red Jackson, and I pulled that out and hung it up specifically for this podcast. You guys remember this from high school. This was my main guitar all during high school and, beyond. It came from a store called Jerome's Sound in Schenectady, New York, and I purchased it on December 26, 1987. So it's an old guitar, a classic now.
I remember the bandana. You used to put the bandana on to mute the strings, whatever fret you needed, to be, so you could get a cleaner sound. You would just pull the bandana. How's he doing that? Between everything.
The guitar would be so loud that the open strings would start vibrating and feeding back, especially if I was doing the tremolo picking stuff. So that was a way to mitigate that issue. Is there any other trivia you guys want to throw in there? Anything come to mind?
I remember going to South Carolina after we got back from the recording. I had like 6 hours to sleep, and then piled about 4 friends into that blue Oldsmobile. And we drove down to Myrtle Beach and had a crazy time,
Those were the days.
Yeah, it was good times. There was always problems with the cars I had all the time. It's always either I was driving into a ravine or flat tires or the paint was peeling off. That car was a mess. As soon as I got it, it was a mess.
We will pick up this conversation at a later point and maybe discuss a different recording studio. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll catch up with you next time.
Hopefully I have enough gas to get home, or else one of you guys is going to be pushing the car.
Yeah. So, guys, tell me what you want for your new year. What are your resolutions?
This year, Peter vows to have sex with something that has only 2 legs.
Yeah.
Kim Chanda Studio, July 22nd, 2019. Unfortunately, it's pouring out, so documenting this studio isn't so easy today. You remember recording there?
I certainly do. I think I'm going to want to come back tomorrow and get a good